City pop is a loose categorization of pop music prevalent mainly from the 1970s to 1980s in Japan that has its roots in soul, R&B, and jazz fusion. In this video, I'm going to explore the history of city pop and do my best to go into a bit more depth as to its cultural significance and origins, as well as explain how it came to be perceived in the state that it is today. We will explore how bands like Sugar Babe or Happy End created a uniquely Japanese take on Western pop music that continues to echo through pop culture to this day. I think before we go any further, it would be important to remember that the roots of the term pop stems from a class of music that has its roots in the mid-1950s in the United States and United Kingdom, as an easy means of denoting punchy, easily accessible tunes written to be palatable to a mainstream consumer market. It would be a mistake, however, to assume that this marketability signified anything of a detractor from the artistic achievement or integrity of these artists. And that's why I think it's so important that we give this genre a good summary and take some time to celebrate who these musicians were and what they did in the Japanese mainstream consumer market at the time. J-pop, as Japanese pop music, is affectionately referred to both inside and outside Japan, is the original classification of Western-influenced music in the country, and has a large following around the world to this day, both domestically and abroad. While it became more visible in the 1990s, we can trace its roots back to the early 1960s and even the pre-war history of Japanese culture. The introduction of Western classical music to Japan is a very interesting tale with how it became prevalent in the Japanese culture. While there's no reliable data on when and how early instruments such as the piano were first introduced to the country, the oldest piano currently in Japan has been preserved by the Kugeyama family in Hagi City, Yamaguchi Prefecture. This piano was brought in by a doctor, Philip Franz Balthasar von Siebold of the Netherlands, who came into Japan in 1823. He reportedly donated the piano to the Kugeyama family when he returned home in 1828. Some of the earliest traces of recorded Western music are intact to this day. 32 catalogs of extant scores, mostly of German Romantic music and songs for mission schools, have survived from the Meiji era. The most popular composer in Japan at the time was Beethoven. Other favorites were Brahms, Schumann, Schubert, and later Bach. In the Meiji era, a music recital would have typically included short pieces by German composers as well as Debussy. Some music teachers, such as Rudolf Dittrich from Austria, were inspired by the woodblock prints of Hiroshige and created short musical pieces about famous landscapes. The illustrious German teacher Franz Eckert taught composition and harmony, wrote military marches, and composed Japan's national anthem as part of his effort to bring Western music to Japan. While traditional instruments and compositions remain at the core of Japanese culture, it was as recently as 1875 that this inspiration from the West took hold as a staple in the selection of tools available to musicians. In fact, the ubiquity of this new set of musical tools led the government to form a cabinet for musical study and development regarding Western music. By the time the 1970s rolled around, Japan had created the second largest economy in the world, rivaled only by the United States. Japan was heavily investing in high-tech manufacturing of automobiles and the steel industry. Conversely, American business ventures had also led to a lot of investment in Japan. Japan's prerogative wasn't necessarily large-scale investment or expansion, but by nature of their own competence at industry and commerce, their presence was growing globally. Japanese businesses would invest in property in the United States. The money was coming in, and with all this modern technology came ways to generate and consume media. The cosmopolitan high life in Japan quickly became accessible to many, and the Japanese music industry took note. American bands hit the airwaves and would travel to Japan to perform. After 1945, Japan became dominant in the music industry and would give rise to technological innovation for the manufacturing of musical instruments. Much of the global pop culture landscape that centered itself around sampling, synths, drum machines, and every branch of sonic creativity owes at least some of its thanks to the innovation of Japan at this time. Artists like Marvin Gaye, Steely Dan, the Beach Boys, Buffalo Springfield, and James Brown exposed large parts of the population to something new, fresh, and different from the Japanese norm at the time, which people in Japan were calling new music. artists like Sugar Babe's Eiichi Ohtaki started to transform the sound of new music from its original rock-like form. With this new jazzy and rhythm and blues type feel, urban and nightlife vibes began to mold new sounds. Such imagery of cosmopolitanism and exciting modern culture was interpreted from influences abroad, and echoed and mutated its way through new musical creations. After the middle of the century, this influence would spread to Japanese musicians all over the country. Many artists and musicians took advantage of this new trend, which quickly snowballed into a multi-million-dollar industry, as fast as economic growth would change the cultural landscape as a whole. While earlier rock music sounds had dominated Japanese popular music, contemporary American styles such as new wave, jazz fusion, and AOR began to seep into the sounds of J-pop. As one of the primary branches of pop music in Japan in the 1970s, city pop artists took this music to the next level with a high rate of success. Artists like Minako Yoshida, Tatsuro Yamashita, Yumi Matsutaya, Taeko Onuki, Momoko, Anri, and Takako Mamiya were so charming and beloved that artists from all over Japanese music scene wanted in on the action. They took the industry and country by storm, with sharp, flush vocals backed by jazzy soundscapes, while peppering in funky new grooves that people just couldn't get enough of. The music was easily accessible listening that anybody could get into, while exhibiting all kinds of different feels and styles, from soul to disco, R&B, jazz, lounge, exotica, classic, orchestral, and funk, all within the same record. The surface level appeal of the music achieved an allure that would hold the attention span of the modern youth at the time, but there was enough artistry and depth to the compositions that the music had the staying power to last in the pop culture consumer market for the better part of a decade. The genre would eventually develop to perhaps use the makings of jazz fusion as the sort of backbone to its sound. In more complex pieces anyways. Artists make use of lots of jazz chords and interesting modulation. Look at the typical structure of a jazz tune played with a lot of funk and flair. Functional harmony is usually used in some way or another. Root movements and cycles that work in a lot of ways that sort of chain into one another. But there's no concise way to explain it because it's all just variations on harmony, and there's a lot of just everything goes in city pop. You might hear a lot of Locrian mode, odd or shifting time signatures with elaborate chord progressions, melodies, and counter melodies. Typically, the instrumentation, whether simple or complex, will feature extended improvised sections that can vary in length, depending on the piece. The circle of fifths is used extensively throughout the genre. Artists would fixate on this progression almost to the point of abuse. As with jazz fusion, it often employs brass and woodwind instruments such as the trumpet or saxophone as melody and soloing instruments, but other instruments often substitute for these, such as synths. The rhythm section typically consists of electric bass, electric guitar, electric piano, or synthesizer. And the character of drums usually has some sort of electronic processing, even if it's just reverb, or sometimes experimentation with drum machines. I think what's most impressive about this music compositionally is how it is written in a manner that could easily be appreciated when listened to in the background on a car stereo or the background of a busy shopping mall, which is ultimately the intention. Despite this, it occasionally offered a surprising amount of compositional depth, given that much of the music's roots rose from more of a jazz fusion influence. The visuals that are associated with the genre are an integral part of the theme of city pop. Aizen Suzuki's illustrations of the past were specifically designed to create a striking allure with capitalistic undertones. This type of look was actually part of a publicity campaign designed to guide public perception of Japanese companies, including Nikon, Suntory, Nissan, and Nippon Oil. Illustrators like Suzuki or Nagai established their style by mixing imagery from American advertisements and pop art, with the surrealism informed by René Magritte and Salvador Dali, helping to create the dreamy sense of billboard bliss that's been so crucial to city pop's lasting appeal. A large, overarching theme in this art was the consideration of how it would be perceived by the United States. Hiroshi Nagai is quoted as saying, "Without American pop art, I would not have started painting the way that I did. This experience made me paint my summer skies with deep blues from that point on." That said, surrealism was also a big influence, and of course, hyperrealism. You can see how this surrealism heightens the allure of hyperconsumerism found in much of the genre. Modern Japanese popular music can be traced back to the Taisho period. when Western instruments such as the strings and harmonica became famous for use in musical performances. Meanwhile, Western jazz and blues also saw an increase in popularity throughout Japan, and modern composers began incorporating Western jazz elements into their work. Jazz retained its popularity until the War of the Pacific, in which the government banned propaganda war songs that included traditional marches. Many important composers from the pre-war era wrote these songs, which came to be perceived as anti-national. After the end of the war, they made their slow return through the country, and jazz would return to popularity once again. Japanese popular music reverted to jazz and blues fusions, and cafes where you could go to hear real jazz, called jazz kisas, popped up everywhere. To entertain Western soldiers, Japanese musicians gradually turned to Western hit songs, transforming their style into their own Japanese music. Ryu Koka literally means popular music, and was in full move until the infamous split in the early 1960s. Ryu Koka, when contrasted to Keiu Kyoku, gives us the distinction of Japanese music compositions with Western elements, and this is considered the essence of modern J-pop. During the 1960s, Keiu Kyoku traditionally ruled with enka, embracing a sort of rockabilly movement. One thing that became famous was the translation of Western songs into Japanese. This gave Keiu Kyoku an increase in popularity, but as time passed, the musicians began to write original compositions based on Western music. Rock and roll carried with it an electric guitar and can be seen all over Japan. A new subspecies of Keiu Kyoku was called group sounds. Group sounds tried to create the rock band with Japanese musicians, but the question of whether rock and roll could be made in Japan gave rise to some cultural contention. Debate between singing in English or Japanese offered a difficult decision for young bands. Finally, group sounds died a few years later when no one could find a clear answer. For example, Ryuichi Sakamoto was accompanied by the band Peanuts, a pair of twins who would make their mark in the classic Japanese monster movie Mothra. The Peanuts were a Japanese vocal group consisting of twin sisters Emi and Yumi Ito. They were born in Nagoya, Japan in 1941. As monozygotic twins, their voices varied only slightly in timbre, which resulted in their singing together sounding sort of like a solo artist utilizing double tracking or reverb. Meanwhile, on Enka's side, artists like Keiko Fuji broke Oricon's records in the late 1960s. It would become an enduring symbol of the conflict between Keiu Kyoku and Enka, especially since the 1970s. The competition for popularity between these acts would give rise to the modern idol scene as we know it today. Although folk music had a clear vogue during the 1960s, most of these songs covered Western hits or had some common universal messages. However, in the early 1970s, trends shifted to the personal and introspective nature of folk music, and the dominant era of singer-songwriter emerged. Singer-songwriter Yosui Inoue set an unprecedented record with his album Kori no Sekai when he topped the Oricon chart for 35 weeks. At the same time, women began to be recognized as musical forces, such as Yumi Matsutoya and Miyoki Nakajima. This era of passionate singer-songwriter was referred to as the New Music era. The Yellow Magic Orchestra and the Southern All-Stars bands began in the late 1970s. The former focused on electronics, and the latter showed that rock music could be sung in Japanese. As a trend at the time, the two left behind new music, and both are still considered to be pioneers of J-pop today. Happy End was a Japanese band active 1969 to 1972. Produced by Hiromi Hosono, Takashi Samoto, Eiichi Ohtaki, and Shigeru Suzuki, the voice of the band was considered an accolade to an improving quality of life as seen by many Japanese at the time. They are considered one of the most influential artists in Japanese music. MTV called Happy End's music rock with psychological points around the edges. In October of 1969, Hirumi Hosono and Takashi Matsumoto set up a group called Blue Valentine, after which their previous rock band, April Fool, had disbanded. It was in March of 1970 that Hosono and Matsumoto, as well as Shigeru Suzuki, contributed to Kenji Endo's Niago album. They were a backing band for Nobuyasu Okabayashi, and changed their name to Happy End to sort of match their overall aesthetic. They made a name for themselves touring for the album Meru Mai ni Tobe. The band began recording their own album in April of 1970. Their self-titled debut album was released in August. The album marked a turning point in Japanese music history, spawning something called the Japanese language rock controversy. There has been much debate among prominent figures in the Japanese rock industry, especially members of Happy End or Yuya Achida, as to whether or not rock music, which is sung entirely in Japanese, is culturally acceptable, as mending Japanese vocals to Western sounds was seen as encroaching a little too far into precious cultural heritage. Before that, almost all popular rock music in Japan was sung in English. Happy End's debut album and their second hit, Kazimachi Roman, was released a year later, demonstrating the resilience of Japanese rock and roll. Happy End has the honor of being the first rock act to sing in Japanese. According to the music critic Ian Martin, they started a style of writing that combined Japanese lyrics with Western-influenced rock to form a trendy mixture of the two. Happy End's music has been touted as one of the points of origin of modern J-pop, with each member playing a role in its development since the group broke up. The band is also considered to be the forerunner of the city pop style. In 2003, the aforementioned album was ranked 4th on HMV Japan's list of the top 100 most important Japanese pop acts. Ohtaki and Hosono are also on the list of solo artists at number 9 and 44 respectively. In September of 2007, Rolling Stone Japan named Kazumichi Roman the greatest Japanese rock album ever. It was also number 15 on the 2009 Bounce list of 54 standard Japanese rock albums. Happy End's debut and Harumi's popularity have enraged the Japanese language rock controversy, but since then, this resulted in a cultural revolution shaping the modern major avenues of Japanese popular music. The success of Happy End stylistically found their roots as, explicitly or implicitly, the earliest traces of the notion of city pop. Artists took advantage of the new flexibility of the Japanese language to embrace the refreshing and trendy styles of the Japanese language in new applications, such as disco, funk, boogie, lounge, and AOR. Japanese musicians, freed from the cultural norms that generally limited the fusion of these genres, had the freedom to personalize the innovation, which coincided with post-war economic growth in Japan. Sugar Babe was a soft rock band which came into being in 1973. The group made its debut at the farewell concert for Happy End. This included Tatsuro Yamashita's pre-explosive solo career, and they were among an increasingly unique cast of Western-influenced bands from the 70s. But because of the influence of Happy End, more musicians were beginning to take something more of a unique voice musically. It was probably the use of seventh major and broken melodies which distinguished them from their contemporaries. Sugar Babe focused on playing well-crafted, upbeat melodies inspired by American pop and soul music from the 60s and 70s. All of these elements, along with the romantic lyrics about life in the city, led to the formation of their debut album, Songs, which laid the foundation for what would later become known as city pop. Songs was released on April 25th of 1975 as the flagship for the record label Ohtaki, a sub-label of Elec Records, one of the first Japanese independent labels. The band's initial reception was quite negative from the mainstream, outside of the crowd of college students, apparently including a young Maria Takeuchi. Without the presence of other similar bands in the mainstream, they faced a lot of criticism. In an interview with Red Bull Academy, Onuki remembers a concert where Sugar Babe were playing. The audience started throwing trash and bottles at them, shouting at them and calling them a bunch of cicadas whenever he sang. The band broke up after their record label went bankrupt in 1976. Yamashita, Muramatsu, and Onuki continued their long and successful careers, and saw the public gradually warming to newer styles as this underground college scene's popularity would spread into the mainstream. They used many of the materials they wrote for their first album, Grey Skies, with Greenwater. Despite little commercial success initially, Grey Sky, and then the following year releasing Sunshower, later turned out to be a landmark in Japan's new music years, consisting of jazz fusion-infused city pop tunes that would open up the market to new possibilities. As city pop grew from a handful of artists to a large pop culture movement, there were a few records that took musical experimentation in all sorts of different directions, such as Pacific, a 1978 album featuring instrumental compositions by Japanese musician Harumi Hosono, Shigeru Suzuki, and Tatsuro Yamashita. If there was an album that completely solidifies the notion that city pop is both accessible on the surface, but made concrete with backing of incredible compositional aptitude, this is perhaps one of the most prominent contenders. Occupying the elements of the city pop collaboration, not only were big names like Hosono, Suzuki, and Yamashita present, but also Ryuichi Sakamoto and Takahashi Yukihiro, who would eventually join Hosono in the Yellow Magic Orchestra. Pacific also reveals what the city has become to symbolize in the visual and oral aesthetics of pop. The dynamism and loneliness of his thematic imagination is evident with its interesting dimension of self-awareness. The pop culture landscape of the 1970s saw opportunities for the empowerment of women in various types of musical pursuits, with varying levels of artistic control or contractual negotiating power, with the likes of Momoe Yamaguchi and the colorful duo Pink Lady. And Yamaguchi became one of the first artists to prominently use English in their songwriting. Although still considered a kyokyoku artist, their style offers a distinction between classic kyokoku and modern J-pop. Yamaguchi and female contemporaries such as Junko Sakurada and Candy created work that would give rise to some exploration of themes of abuse and the treatment of women in prominent pop culture celebrity roles. The 1980s saw the explosion of the idol era. The idols of the golden age marked the end of the kyokoku era, with many kyokoku-style composers and songwriters turning to the making of female idols before retiring. Kyokoku took another boost in popularity when artists like Seiko Mitsuda released an unprecedented series of singles on the Oricon charts. Other female artists such as Akina Nakamori dared to challenge the iconic image of the girl next door by taking a more direct sexual approach and singing songs about heartbreak and cheating. She was a prominent yet controversial figure who had a presence in different mediums such as acting and variety shows. However, her suicide attempt led to a sharp decline in her popularity, indicating that Japan was unprepared to deal with the darker side of idol culture. She would continue in the scene with some moderate success in later years, but regardless of her lack of prolific songs in recent times, Nakamori was honored by Japanese music critics as the 5th best voice in the country's recording history, even ahead of her rival Seiko Matsuda at 7th place. According to the Oricon charts, she is one of the handful of singers who managed to have an album in the top 10 of the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s, proving her resilience to the taste of the changing musical industry. Meanwhile, Happy End's disbanded members would pursue successful solo careers, largely continuing to define the new music and city pop sound. Happy End's members straddled the line between high culture and pop, and soon acquired a reputation as seminal figures in the history of Japanese popular music. Harumi Hosono, Ryuichi Sakamoto, and Takahashi Yukihiro perhaps gained some of the most interesting creative momentum with the formation of Yellow Magic Orchestra, bending the genre to create the bravest and perhaps weirdest pop music ever. They did everything from funk to video game-influenced music to passionate art pop and new romantic that shaped Sakamoto. Their revolutionary ideological demonstration made it influential in various forms of electronic music, cited by Jay Dilla as an influence and even covered by Michael Jackson. Their influence's reach was perhaps one of the largest international manifestations of music that fell under the city pop umbrella. They were also cited by Juan Atkins and Derek May as later key influences on the creation of genres like Detroit techno. The Tokyo Trio certainly played a significant role in the early years of electronic music. Unlike their German-Turkish counterparts, whose electrical success took them through stadium tours and into museums, YMO's work did not achieve the same explosive popularity in the West, in part due to the involvement with each member's own respective busy solo career. Light, joyous, yet committed to imaginative rigor, YMO built the entire aesthetic universe from album to album, reflecting the changing creative landscape. From technodelic cyber-communism of 1981 to Naughty Boy of 1983 and its service to hyper-comedy, including numerous television skits satirizing supernatural cinematography, this aesthetic of the band's unwavering commitment can still be felt around the world. With MTV-ready music videos and ultra-stylish, eclectic performances, YMO differentiates between the blasphemous early roots of experimentation and the ancestral quality of larger-than-life American pop stars. I don't think it's a stretch to say that their influence either directly or indirectly hit most stylistically similar musicians in the Japanese scene after their success. After a brief hiatus to further their solo careers, the trio began experimenting with new electronic voices, and on their 1993 immediate reunion album, Technodon, they updated their soundtrack to stumping techno and acid house elements, exploring the manipulation of repetition as a musical motif. At the same time, Ryuichi Sakamoto's solo career as an actor and film composer was flourishing, a trend that will continue with the release of his 16th album, Async, earlier this year. Seemingly buried deep in the minds of Arca, Yves Tomar, and One-Thrix Point Never, it seems that a new generation of musicians were beginning to recognize Sakamoto's abilities, both as a solo artist in nearly 3 decades with YMO. Yellow Magic Orchestra has achieved a unique place in Japanese culture and throughout the world. At the peak of the bubble era, many Japanese managed to develop a new level of independence and self-determination. As citizens began to buy more and more property, women saw the door open to higher-paying jobs, education, and civil rights. The notion of becoming an empowered individual by the economic currents that were running through the culture were reflected in the sonic output of pop culture. City pop productions became denser, taking on more of a frenetic jazz fusion type of energy, with complex chord experimentation, interesting song structures, and the employment of new technology that was being developed locally. At the same time, the melodies began to change. Female performers began to sing openly about taboo subject matter previously unheard of in music. As well, pleasures like good food, fashion, cool cars, travel, and nightlife were prominent. It was very unusual for themes of this nature to be sung by women up to this point, especially on themes such as the desire and search for men, sometimes with great enthusiasm. Some of this unfamiliar content may have been seen as obscene at the time, but this shift in perception inspired female musicians to work with a newfound confidence. This feeling of personal empowerment was echoed by nearly every musician and is palpable through the vibes created by their creations. With hits like Takako Mamiya's Love Trip and Akina Nakamura's Bitter and Sweet, fans heard new hints about physical contact and public openness. Recording music at the time was extravagant, with the best musicians experimenting and making use of modern high-fidelity studio mastering. Even in the era of near-perfect digital production, it is clear that the people who created this music have their hearts and souls poured into it. By modern standards, the level of production quality found on some of these staple albums, like Tatsuro Yamashita's For You, is unmatched by many modern musicians. Around 1987, when much of the music revolved around ideas of the good life, city pop began to almost develop something of an artificial feel. In the interest of artistic advancement, many artists were starting to experiment with alternative themes, this time inspired by Kyokyoku, fusion, and the new wave. They would gradually experiment with adding more English lyrics. A large cultural shift would occur in the late 1980s. Japan suffered a sudden and catastrophic economical catastrophe, and everything stopped. Many Japanese companies were investing in real estate and doing very lucrative financial deals due to all the gains in the economy. Japanese banks made a lot of loans, which were in turn used to buy real estate that were used as collateral for the shares. This would allow further borrowing that would result in a bubble that would eventually give way to complete collapse, seemingly overnight. This devastation was felt immediately by most citizens. The term Baburu Keizai refers to this event. Most pop culture that played off of the economic boom fell out of fashion overnight. It was difficult to produce inspiring and exciting music and sell records that glorified wealth and luxury when their target market lost all of their income and savings. The vision of unlimited wealth and opportunity was smashed against the reality of extreme inflation. To put this in perspective, a property in central Tokyo that was considered immovable fell from about 300,000 yen per square meter to 100,000 or less, and proved nearly impossible to lease. Some say its effects are still visible in Japan. I'm sure most families have a chapter in their history that involved some sort of struggle or sacrifices that had to be made during those times. Decades of growth and success ended with an intense emotional dependency on endless earnings, and city pop disappeared from the Japanese society. This is perhaps why Shibuya-Kei was so popular as a spiritual successor. This loosely defined movement spanned the late 1980s and early 90s with its ironic and introspective take on consumerism and mass market culture, which was well received by young consumers who had grown bored with city pop's flamboyancy. The success of Shibuya-Kei opened the doors for indie acts and new experimentation. Despite its reputation as one of Japan's most influential cultural exports, for the past 15 or so years, the genre has been ridiculed as the founders of the movement abandoned their distinctive voices and called for distance from the terminology due to shifts in the way that people began to consume music. If you are a fan of city pop, I would highly recommend checking out the genre as there are quite a few stylistic similarities. In fact, I even made a video about Shibuya-Kei. It's on this channel if you're interested in learning more. Earlier on, we had mentioned Takahashi Yukihiro. He is now part of one of the most interesting supergroups ever conceived, as many of his bandmates are pioneers of Shibuya-Kei. This includes Keigo Oyamada, Toa Tei, Yoshinori Tsunahara, Tomohiko Gondo, and Ryo Imai. If you're interested in hearing YMO's sounds alongside some of the best genius that Japan's musical industry has to offer, I would highly recommend listening to their small yet intriguing catalog. And they even claim to still be active, so let's hope that they go somewhere with that. In Moritz Summit's paper, Intermediality and the Discursive Construction of Popular Music Genres, the Case of Japanese City Pop, an interesting point regarding the perception of genres' meaning is made when discussing what really defines popular music's genre, with exploration of semiotics citing Yuri Lotman in 2001. The author explores how a popular musical genre can be conceptualized as a semiosphere that is transtextual and transmedial, and operates in both asynchronic and diachronic dimensions. Within this sphere operates a musical ecological system that engages in semiotic translation between various types of oral, textual, and visual signifiers, and that musicalizes them, creating musical meaning out of medially diverse cues. What holds these intermediately translated signifiers together and forces them into more or less distinct genre is supposedly nothing sometimes but the name of the genre in question, something which is so meaningful that it may become the unique element capable to synthesize the identity of that particular music. In other words, the author holds that it could be something as simple as the public's superficial perception of the genre's name that gives rise to its broader classification and perception. These tunes in Japan weren't necessarily always classified as belonging under the same umbrella. As they state, some texts published during the first city pop revival create elaborate genealogies that sometimes go out of their way to establish such connections between Happy End, the 1970s, new music, and city pop scene, and the 1980s artists. From this time on, it becomes relatively common to use the term city pop simply as an alternative name for the kind of new music that Happy End and their close friends and associates were producing, a type of usage that is still common today. Some guides use the term as a point of departure for a Happy End-centric reading of Japanese pop history in general. One text about proto-city pop even attempts to trace the roots of the genre back to the pre-war. World War II, for example, gave rise to subcultures that were opposed to commercialization. This type of perception is often lost in brief summarization of the movement, where the visibility of a genre can never be fully clarified in pop music because different eras use them for different purposes. Genres of music often undergo technical adaptation and refinement as they are replicated for a younger audience or otherwise reserved for commercial interests. I think one important note to make here is perhaps the grouping of many of these artists under the same umbrella, where the name city pop is more of a modern classification, and this definition was much fuzzier at the time. Tokyo Night Fever by Kevin Ostley explores the theory of code switching in city pop, which concerns the functionality and meaning of switching back and forth between English and Japanese in the lyrics of music, which can even happen multiple times in the same sentence. He explores some interesting examples of this on a per-song basis, and gives a very detailed explanation on some of the literary or linguistic mechanics behind these lyrics. It's interesting that he notes that the absolute number of switches in his sample doubled between the 70s and 80s, and while you should go check out the paper as it's excellently written and very interesting, I can't help but begin to explore the idea that the increase in code switching from one decade to the next marks a relaxation of the prescription of a certain language holding a certain status artistically in pop culture. It is an interesting final takeaway that he notes The English components integrated were seen to accomplish different purposes. Functions of English code switching and lyrics analyzed constituted intensification, specification, adding background elements, metaphor, and contrast. And as a foreign listener, or somebody like me who has a very rudimentary understanding of Japanese, this probably has the added effect of layering extra mystique from the perspective of the current day YouTube SoundCloud audience. In a hilarious and strange move by YouTube's algorithm, seemingly out of nowhere, suddenly millions were drawn to watch Mireya Takeuchi's 1984 song, Plastic Love. In the year of its release, the song only peaked at number 85 on Oricon, but seemingly as a fluke, the popularity of certain other genres gave rise to huge amounts of views on the source material. Warner Music Japan filmed and released a short music video in May of 2019 for the first minute and 49 seconds of Plastic Love. Although its length is more desirable to the short attention span of today's clickbait-hungry audiences, one can't help but notice that the film seems a little bit out of touch as to why the sound resonates with people so well today. That's probably not something I really need to go into, as I think that other filmmakers have done a really good job explaining the modern appeal of this genre. You will probably encounter other tracks like Remember Summer Days, I'm in Love, Telephone Number, Angel Touch, and Alone. These are great places to start exploring the world of city pop, but don't be afraid to dive into the albums. You can find some links to some excellent guides to the genre among my sources in the description. It's important not to overlook perhaps the other largest cultural center which gave birth to a range of talented city pop influences, South Korea. During city pop's birth, South Koreans found their country at a turning point for democracy, modern politics, and societal issues. Cheeky, high-culture pop music wasn't the top concern on everybody's mind until it was. The 1988 Seoul Olympics marked a period of reform as President Roh Tae-woo's election saw a spectrum of new personal freedoms that afforded a society hungry for some of the cultural successes of its neighbors abroad, and that's what happened. Club culture and nightlife suddenly grew to define common culture. Digging Club Seoul is a series that recognizes some of the overlooked gems from this era, and Reddit user KRS Jun highlights very aptly in a post that I will quote and link to in the description. Listening to the singles, you can hear a noticeable difference between the first 5 singles of the series, released in 2018, and the second 5 from 2019. George's cover of After a Long Time, the first single from the series, sounds pretty one-to-one with its Kim Hyun-chul original. Likewise, Daybreak's cover of You Always by Mono and Stella Jang's cover of It's Beautiful by Yoo Sun-il sound very much like city pop, with more modern, polished production. These are mostly faithful recreations in that style, and my personal favorites, Sunwoo Jungga's and Sultans of the Disco's singles, are nice interpretations, more in the artist's own style. Regarding the modern covers or recreation of some early work, he goes on to say, these tracks feel more like transplants of the melodies and lyrics from the covered songs into the artist's own modes. With these singles, I think I like them to the degree that I like the artists covering them and their styles. The project has been ongoing since 2018 to uncover Korean city pop gems from its peak era. With a new set of singles set to release in 2020, Kim Hong-ki, the director of Space Oddity, notes the nondescript origins of Digging Club Seoul. An office employee had been playing Japanese city pop in the office a lot, noting that it was a trend recently, which prompted his deep dive into research about 1980s South Korea. Finally, his summary of the attitude that surrounds some of the mystique of this sound is something that must resonate with a lot of people who grew up in this era. I don't need to write a 2,000-word essay about the stresses of expectation and a slowing economy that Korean youth go through today. I need only look to my parents across the dinner table. Kids today have it way harder, my dad says, succinctly putting into words what dozens of New York Times op-eds about the dark side of Korean education or pop industry or working society or whatever couldn't. Please see the description for the link to the full version of his post. Artists like Yukika bring the classic sound together with modern sensibilities full circle. Yukika Teramoto, simply known as Yukika in the Korean scene, is a Japanese-born actress, singer, and former model and voice actress. In 2019, Teramoto released her debut Korean solo single, Neon, which had a new retro girl concept based on the city pop genre. For a more classical taste of Korean city pop, check out records like the self-titled Spring, Summer, Autumn, Winter, who were a jazz rock fusion band that debuted in 1988. They had songs like Bravo, My Life, and Somebody's Dream. SSAW disbanded on December 28th of 2018 following the death of member Tae Gwan. Light and Salt, Jang Pil-soon, Kim Hyung-chul were other influential artists in the scene who have since moved on to other pursuits, but their discographies all deserve some attention. There are so many modern city pop artists from both countries that deserve attention as well. I might have to do a follow-up video as I wanted to keep this one a little bit shorter. I want to leave this video in a somewhat open-ended place, as there's much more to talk about, so please subscribe for coverage on more related artists, record labels, and genres. Thank you for watching. If you like, subscribe, and share this video, it helps me to produce more videos in the future. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys next time. And if you want to go the extra mile, I do have a Patreon page up if you would like to support this channel. Don't feel obligated or pressured to do this, but if you feel like helping, an increase in my budget is only going to help make these videos better and more frequent.